Basic income through the eyes of history, it's pretty much on the open movie projects, human survival. It's just basic income in the context of a wider human history of survival. And so it's divided into 7 parts. It's through the ages, and we focus on the basic income revival, and also in the future vision, back to basic with basic income. So the prologue is just a quick about Earth transition into habitable life. And early human civilization, we have the hunter-gatherer society, and it was a egalitarian society, communal economy, and nobody goes hungry unless everyone is. And so researcher theorized that that's how humans were able to go through, pass through the mass extinction event. And then we transitioned to agriculture. Initially, during transition was communal still, and as we grow, become more territorial, more hierarchy, and then we start seeing wars. And through the cradle of civilizations and growth of urban centers. And during Confucius era, he says that if everybody have enough basic sustenance, then there will be less contention, and people will be striving to better themselves. And at that time also, there was a peasant revolt throughout. Whenever there's as wealth inequality grows, we see it in the prosperous dynasty of China and Tang Dynasty. And then before Renaissance, Rome has fallen, and there's new empires emerging. But the wealthy Florence, people have freedom, and they're a more tolerant society towards, and drives innovation. And they gave us Da Vinci, and who is a genius, of course, and they tolerated his eccentricity. And around the same time, Galileo and Bruno didn't have much the same fate. They were branded as heretics for introducing new concepts and ideas. And Bruno was burned at the stake. And around the Enlightenment era, we have Newton and other inventions coming out and ideas. So, and then as we move into the Industrial Revolutions, England was at the forefront of that. We see a Luddite and a swing riot destroying machines, which are taking people's jobs away. And new poor law was introduced that restrict relief to prison-like workhouses. And Charles Dickens was appalled, so he wrote a novel called Oliver Twist based on the workhouses. And of course, along that timeline, there's also various peasant revolt whenever their livelihoods are threatened. And they're often taken advantage of by people seeking power, and sometimes it's not to their advantage. So it was a contentious era. There's lots of labor strife, trying to reduce work hours and other grievances. There's depressions, riots, and labor strike in Winnipeg, in Philadelphia. And it's also around this time that the Bolshevik was rising in Russia. And interestingly, as the immigrants from Europe was flocking to Canada, some people viewed them as inferior, and they tried to implement a policy called sterilization based on the survival of the fetus being applied politically and sociologically instead of like Darwin's biological. So Leilani Muir was one of the Albertans that was victimized because she was in an abusive family. So she has an IQ of 60, and so they deem her that she should not be reproducing, so they sterilized her. And she found out when she was an adult and sued the government. And but they retested her IQ again, it was 100. So we see that like people in an abusive environment take it out that their intelligence improved. So with poverty, I guess the president candidate for US, Young, mentioned that in his book about the poverty and showing low IQ. And child abuse also, research showed this permanent damaged brain, but the succeeding, the persistent volume that follows usually are worse. So those, and then Roosevelt tried to introduce New Deal to deal with that problem, but around 50s, 60s, we're back to the more unrest, and Martin Luther King proposed guaranteed income as a solution to this in his chaos or community. And Nixon actually introduced guaranteed income based on the findings from the Kennedy Johnson researchers in their fight with the war on poverty. And it's interesting because 1930s was the time of depression, is how Hitler came from a fringe party, take advantage of the disenchantment among the poor, and of course, the rest. And industrial, so when Nixon introduced it, it was actually a very wide acceptance from the public, from the polls, from the newspaper. And Life magazine says that this will be the end of racism. And the Southern politicians, of course, would like to retain their racial divisive politics and was opposed to the Nixon's plan. And he has to go to Congress, but the Ways and Means in Congress was chaired by Wilbur Mills, and he's a Democrat, but he's a very fiscally conservative person. But just like Nixon, they were able to overcome their ideological bias by really reviewing notes and researching and analyzing it, and he came to the conclusion that this is nothing more than actually helping people in need. So welfare continues, and there's a lady, Teresa Pipicello, which is a single mother, and she become activist. She relates how it was that the money is going mostly to bureaucrats, it's not going to the people in need, and the mother was living in the front line, constant crisis. And children are dying because the houses are burning down from people in poverty not having to pay for heating, so they're using stove. So yeah, and she cried, being treated like criminals. So the last progressive president, he's a highly controversial president. Watergate, everyone knows, and also has attacked the press. And he claimed that his opponent did the same to him, spying on him. So he was just, but anyway. So I guess, but his motivation is probably because he grew up in a family that was struggling, and his mother, because his brother was sick for a long period of time, tuberculosis. So he was glad that they never went into welfare. He called that the undignified system, and so he's probably motivated by that. He's trying to find a solution to welfare, and he took on the basic income or guaranteed income. And he also introduced universal health care, and which researchers says, reviewing it says it's actually more progressive than Obama. And Noam Chomsky says, who's a left academic from the left, and says he's the last progressive president. So on to the 80s, the early information on the food and burnings, systematic burnings policy was enforced. I call it the self-interest politics. They viewed people as inherently evil. There's a business side, but you can control them through marketing. Bernie called it PR because propaganda is a dirty word after war. And so they're marketing to the political marketing to people's selfish desire. And Reagan wanted to cut welfare, but of course conscientious people are going to oppose, so they come up with a mythical welfare queen. So this is just continuation of ancient England was vagrants or criminals, so these are their fault, or they're fraudster, and so kind of neutralized the opposition. And Reagan was also a governor of California at that time that Nixon was passing the guaranteed income, and he has presidential vision, and he was a very vocal opponent of that plan. Then on to Clinton era, I would say the self-interest politics continued. He enacted workfare, which is AKA get rid of welfare. And Dr. Moynihan was upset that he says history will shame them, and he has cabinet members resign in disgust that he's focusing more on re-election than anything. In Canada, we see a lot of every election they call it boutique, that Senator Edelman mentioned last night, boutique tax credit that keeps growing, and it's not efficient, it's expensive, and it just keep growing, targeting. And actually, I came back to Ontario to see my relatives, and I hear a lot of people talking about Wings daycare for 2-year-old fan, and they said, what about the rest of us, without 2-year-old kids? So the problem with the targeted system. And but there's two psychologists which looks into why we act this way, why we sometimes act like irrationally. Tversky, Kahneman, and they come with cognitive bias. But one of the good findings they had was that when you train a young kid, the young youth, very young, that they will be less vulnerable to cognitive bias. So the narrow fake news and also like we see politicians manipulating people, like demagogue. So I guess it would be good to introduce this in a secondary education. So, and for advocates of transformative policy, it's also good to know about cognitive bias so that I guess we can better communicate. I just grouped it, these are common cognitive bias, the fear factors or impression and perception bias. An example, like risk loss aversion by the pair of psychologists was that if you tell a patient 10% chance that they're going to die in the surgery, they're going to turn it down. But if you tell them they have 90% chance of survival, they're going to accept it. So the same rate, if you tell people that research showed 9% of people drop out of the workforce as a result of basic income, they would think this sort of society as they appeared. But if you say 91% continue working, then maybe that sounds more positive. And also, people rather blame the poor than change. The people fear changes, and if someone knows false, there's nothing needs to change. Infographics also work because our minds like shortcut. And also the intelligence, people with high IQ is not immune to cognitive bias. And as one American journalist says, smart people use intellect to obtain not correct answer, but answer that they want. And confrontation bias and stereotype, people say there's a large number of blacks are incarcerated, therefore blacks are more inherently tend towards criminality. A large number of indigenous people are in substance abuse, therefore if you give them basic income, they're just going to use it for alcohol and everything. So all those sort of cognitive bias, but historical trauma is real and it's still fresh because a lot of the indigenous youth right now are still living with parents who's undergone that. So they're going in a challenging environment. And hindsight bias, I'm not going to get through too much, but millennium versus baby boomer, I would say, has to do with hindsight bias. And study shows that people with stereotypes like thinking a group is violent or lazy is likely to support welfare. And there's two precursor social ills. Poverty, trauma is kind of, I would say, interlinked because people in poverty are less likely to suffer trauma, and at the same time, people who are abused or other form of trauma are likely to fall into poverty. And these are all things that can cost the society. And Canada in 2014, 117,000 is about, I think, the average cost of incarcerating one prisoner. It's like 170,000. And so so we need a two-pronged attack, I guess. Basic income, deal with economic insecurity and any untoward incident, while we also need rehabilitations and mental health. So basic income. There was an income experiment back in the 70s at Winnipeg, and also a dolphin is a saturated site, so everyone could join. And this was never implemented. I guess we need a visionary leader and fierce leader like Tommy Douglas. So he was, despite very coordinated and influential lobbies, including from U.S. health insurance, launching attack and putting the government and the journalists at that time called it under siege. He pursued it and pushed it through. And so basically, so they have income experiment, and I'm not going to talk too much, but interestingly, in the 1990s, there was a McDonald Commission report, which is that time, which is the basis for why we adopt NAFTA. And Mulroney, some reports says Mulroney is looking into it and interested in it. For some reason, he implemented NAFTA, but without the basic income or guaranteed income. And yes, so The same thing, Chrétien later on was looking into it and then was mocked by conservative opposition, and he dropped it. So, what's the real cost of basic income? I guess I can go through how to pay for it. And it's not a question of can't afford. Like, there's if total the spending for poverty-related costs on all levels of government is about 74 billion. And the parliamentary budget officer come up with 76 billion as the costs, and then there's 30 billion that could become obsolete, so the cost actually of just about 46 billion. That's for the negative income tax. So there's really no reason not to implement it. Politician who says it's not affordable either didn't do homework or maybe they love their big tax. An economist who says the old ways is better, and is probably like Aristotle follower, not Aristotle, but his follower, who would rather brand people heretic than look at new ideas. And what's the economic reality? Millennials are having difficulty, like they're living with their parents longer because they cannot afford it. Developing Canadians are increasing because they're struggling to make ends meet. There's a precariousness in jobs, and it's dangerous because one Intercept interview was in Nigeria about the youth unemployment, and the youth jokingly said, maybe he's joking, that maybe he'll just join ISIS and go to the mountain. In the Philippines, back in the peak of insurgency, communist insurgency, you see a lot of people in poverty going to the mountain solution. And Einstein talked about the era of changes to machine that maybe we can share the workload more. But I guess our minimum wage, like in Ontario, $15 based on a full-time job. But now there's more precariousness, more part-time. So is that $30 then, $40 for the businesses? And also businesses hesitant to hire more people. They tend to staff to one people. So maybe there's some restructuring you can do, like payroll taxes or something, that makes it attractive for business, and full pensions or stuff like that. And the way to the future. So back to basic, with basic income, where people are look after each other like before, but the individualism is preserved, like during the Renaissance era. So Stephen Hawking says we can either have figure out how to share wealth, that we have a luxurious future, or most of us will be miserably poor, while few who owns the machine will be super rich. So we can think big. So this is NIT for sure. We already know it's affordable. But what if we, like the grand strategy overall, like we can offer like free transportation, free education. Europe already has it. Scandinavian countries have 50%. It was worked out well. So 50% flat tax, universal income, say a basic income, and only the top million. Like if you're earning million, then you might see a bit. Like, but what is 10,000 for a millionaire, right? Like 500,000. Yes. So education, of course, will be key, and bankruptcy protection. Maybe you can do it in trust. Basic incomes are in trust. Investment in the people, so protect them from bankruptcy claims. And calamities becoming more of a daily occurrence, like in Puerto Rico and the Philippines. So if you have, like in Greece, they're fighting the bailout, they introduced smart card to give the poor so they can withdraw money. And you can have similar, so people suffering from calamity, or if the bank collapses because of the problem, not the flow of people, they have income security. They don't have to worry about it. So this is just plan for animation infographics. So this is once that too is taken care of with basic income, surviving. So safety and security. So there's more connection to community, self-esteem, and on the top, like Martin Luther and Confucius say, people will try to excel themselves. They will seek self-improvement once they have those security. And yes, and if you want to check out the project or help out in a way, you can check Creator Method, big open movie. Thank you very much.